Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this session, Literature as a Bridge to Global Skills, in which I'll try to show you the key role literature can play in the contemporary language classroom in developing skills needed to communicate in today's interconnected, multicultural world. And we're going to begin with a quick activity to get your brains in the right place and to get you thinking about how culture and language are connected. So look at this picture for a few seconds. And I'd like to do a visualization activity with you. If you don't mind, you could close your eyes and imagine that you are lying at the beach, lying comfortably, very relaxed. You've completely forgotten about work. You can hear the sound of the waves reaching the shore. You can hear the sound of the seagulls flying by. You can smell the salty air. Maybe there's some music playing in the background. Now keep your eyes closed and I'm going to read you a poem. And I'd like you to try and see the poem in your mind as I read it. So, Daddy at the seaside, Daddy in the sun, Daddy on a surfboard, Daddy having fun, Daddy getting buried in the sand up to his chin. Help, he yells, please dig me out before the tide comes in. All right, so open your eyes if they were closed and let's look at the poem together. So here it goes again. Daddy at the seaside, Daddy in the sun, Daddy on a surfboard, Daddy having fun, Daddy getting buried in the sand up to his chin. Help, he yells, please dig me out before the tide comes in. And do you think the people in the poem are having fun? You can answer me in the chat box if you like. And think about the kinds of things that you do with your family or close friends to have fun. What kind of things you like to do? You can tell me in the chat box if you like. Maybe you like to get together with your friends for coffee. Maybe you like to get together with other members of your family and cook meals together. And think the things that you do with your family and friends, are they typical of people in your culture, would you say? All right. I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. And here's another picture of the beach. And we're going to look at another beach poem here. Let's look at this one together. I'll read it out loud in case anybody's watching on a small screen. With crisps with sand and cake with sand is grand with lunch or tea. Crunch it up, enjoy it, love. At least we're by the sea. Did you like that one? I hope you like that one. I love that short poem. I love how it captures the sensation of being at the beach. Think for a second about when you spend time in nature. What feelings or sensations do you associate with it? Again, if you want, you can answer me in the chat box. Maybe you like the kind of damp air when you go into the forest, or maybe just like the clean air when you go out into the countryside. British people like me, we make a big deal out of going to the beach, or at least going outside on hot days, but we particularly like foreign vacations. Why do you think that is? So 2 poems about the beach. Think for a second as language teachers. How do poems like the ones, like this one on the slide and the one we just looked at, how do they support language learning? These are poems that are suggested for use in the young learner's classroom. If you like, you can answer me in the chat box. How do poems like the 2 that we've just read support language learning? I'll give it a few seconds to think about that. And so you're probably thinking rather obvious things, no? Repetition, rhyme, developing awareness and pronunciation and speaking skills. And also for young learners, They provide a template of patterns for future grammar. I mean, it's probably not advisable to teach grammar explicitly in the young learner classroom, but poems like these contain lots of repetition and lots of grammatical structures that are repeated. And so those can serve as a template for future grammar patterns. And of course, poems are a form of literature, right? And other forms of literature that can easily be employed in language teaching and learning include folk literature, children's stories, teen fiction, short stories, non-fiction, poetry, novellas, novels, science fiction, and fantasy. And from a purely language-focused viewpoint, we can rationalize the use of literature on the grounds that it provides a wealth of vocabulary, and moreover, vocabulary in context, as we can see from the poem on the slide. It also provides endless examples of grammar patterns, develops reading and listening skills that also support the development of productive skills. Further theoretical justifications for using language in the classroom can be found in the fact that language acquisition requires massive amounts of input, and literature can be a source of that input. Literature can be cognitively engaging for language learners, taking lessons beyond the monotony of language practice. Literature may also lower learners' affective filter, as it can be associated with enjoyment. It may also drive motivation and the associated investment in learning tasks, which is believed to be a major factor in successful language development. Furthermore, poems and literature are examples of authentic text, and authenticity may also be a driver of motivation, and it will help students make connection between the language classroom and the real world. So lots of arguments there for using literature in the classroom. The poems that we read show that language and culture are intertwined. And in this particular case, they provided a lovely insight into the experience of a day at the beach for British people. Indeed, as the authors of one recent book on the use of literature in the classroom for developing intercultural skills argue, foreign literary works are cultural testimonies that may reflect stereotypes and prejudices, but at the same time offer the opportunity to carry out intercultural reflections to overcome these simplified visions. Think about that for a second. I think that's a lovely quote to justify the use of literature for working with culture. Yes, we're going to see stereotypes and stereotypical representations, but the very nature of literature means that we're going to go deeper beyond those simple stereotypes. But perhaps you're thinking, that's great. And maybe that would work well with older, more motivated or higher level students whose English is sufficient to read novels and other kinds of authentic texts. But what about beginners? Well, literature doesn't have to mean long or complex texts. In the preschool and lower primary classroom, nursery rhymes offer the same benefits as the poems that we just saw. And in fact, those two poems, as I mentioned before, were designed or suggested for use in the primary classroom. Let's have a look at another example of shorter texts. So for the purpose of language teaching, proverbs are an extremely manageable and accessible form of literature. Very short, of course. What's more, proverbs can provide insight into the underlying values and realities of a culture. Let me show you how. We're going to look at 3 proverbs, and I'd like you to think about 2 questions. So question 1 is, do you understand the meaning of the proverb? And question 2 is, do you think the proverbs imply any cultural values? And again, of course, you can put your suggested answers in the chat box for me. So here's the first one. A stitch in time saves 9. A stitch in time saves 9. So first question, do you understand the meaning of the proverb? And if you wish, you can answer me in the chat box. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So a stitch in time saves 9. What's the idea or the meaning of that proverb? And the second part of the question is, do you think the proverb implies any cultural values? So again, I'll give you a few seconds to think about and answer that question. So stitch in time saves 9. What does it mean? Does it carry any cultural values? And so the meaning of this one is that it's better to deal with problems immediately rather than letting them escalate into bigger problems now. If you detect a problem now, deal with it now rather than waiting until it gets out of hand. And if we try to identify values associated with that proverb, we could say, for example, that it suggests that we value taking care over the things that we do, that we value careful work, doing things right the first time or from the beginning, right? So there seems to be the value of valuing care over our work there. Here's a second proverb: waste not, want not. So first question, what does it mean? Do you get the meaning of waste not, want not? You can answer me in the chat box if you like. What does waste not, want not mean? I'll give you a few more seconds to answer that one. And at the same time, start thinking about the second question. Does it convey any implicit values? So what does it mean? And does it convey any implicit values? I'll give you a few more seconds to type in the chat. And so the meaning of waste not, want not is that if you're careful, or if we are careful with how we use the things that we have, such as food or time or money, then we're less likely to find ourselves in need or lacking later on. So be careful with what we have now so that we don't run out later. And in terms of kind of values that it implies, it seems to suggest that we value ethical or responsible consumption, resourcefulness, self-discipline with our resources, maybe. Okay, let's do one more. Third proverb for you. Empty vessels make most noise. So the same question here. What does it mean? You can tell me in the chat box. And does it seem to imply any cultural values? Give you a few seconds. So what does it mean? Empty vessels make most noise. Does it seem to imply any cultural values? A few seconds more. So the meaning of this one is that those with the least knowledge and the least talent are the ones who often speak the loudest or speak the most. Or to put it another way, people who talk a lot about their knowledge, talent, or experience are often not as knowledgeable, talented, or as experienced as they claim or say they are. And it seems to imply that we value modesty, humility, and discretion. So there you go. There's a simple example of how we might work with culture and language with very short texts. And this could work with lower level learners. And hopefully, as you can see, even these very short phrases, these very short proverbs carry cultural baggage. Now, in recognition of the fact that today's young and teenage language learners will likely be using their English in intercultural, multilingual contexts, we've seen the integration of a focus on global citizenship, on issues like sustainability, and on the development of what we can sometimes, well, what some people call global skills, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity into language teaching materials in recent years. And this is manifested through, for example, the presence of intercultural reading texts, or community projects, unit themes such as recycling and the environment. This current trend for developing global skills reflects recognition that simply teaching facts or providing information about other cultures is not enough. There needs to be a focus on the development of the skills that we can use to facilitate intercultural communication. A main proponent of this approach is Michael Byrom. He describes, as we can see from the quote on the screen, the intercultural speaker as someone with an ability to interact with others, to accept other perspectives and perceptions of the world, to mediate between different perspectives, and to be conscious of their evaluations of difference. And Byrom actually proposes a framework for planning language courses in order to integrate the development of intercultural competence. His model of intercultural communicative competence includes the following elements, which we can see on the slide. So it begins with communicative competence, which is what we do already, working with language, skills, discourse, and social cultural features of the language. But on top of that, he adds cultural knowledge, which is a focus on learners acquiring knowledge and understanding, not just information about people who speak the language that they are learning, and not just native speakers. And knowledge here includes, for example, conventions of communication in one's own language and culture, as well as in the culture and the language that we are learning, and knowledge of what causes cultural misunderstandings. It could also include things like historical and contemporary relationships between the country or the culture of the person that or the people that we will be interacting with, and information about the education system, religious institutions, and other things that form and are associated with a national identity. For example, someone like me, a foreigner coming to work in Mexico, I would need to know how to adapt my language according to the degree of formality. I'd need to know that a lot of Mexican people take religion very seriously, and that the church plays a significant role in everyday life, and very much so in education. But to communicate effectively in intercultural contexts, learners need more than just knowledge. They also need to develop intercultural skills of inquiry through which knowledge about the self and others can evolve. These are skills that will help learners function effectively in real time in intercultural contexts. Byrom refers to these as skills of interpreting and relating, and skills of discovery and interaction. With these skills, students would be able to analyze, for example, written or spoken documents such as news reports or websites in order to identify stereotypes, generalizations, connotations, implicit values, and beliefs. And they'll be able to mediate and intervene in intercultural situations in real time in order to overcome barriers which are the result of stereotypes, generalizations, implicit values, and things like that. And this, of course, would be really useful in an international intercultural workplace. So that's knowledge and skills. But Byrom also advocates the encouragement and planned development of attitudes of openness and curiosity about other cultures, so that we're interested in the daily life experiences of others and interested in discovering different perspectives on our own and others' social groups and practices. And according to this view, we need to become aware of our own perspectives and values and be willing to question them and decenter. Byrom refers to having learners develop readiness to suspend disbelief about other cultures and to suspend belief about one's own culture. In addition to this, Byrom proposes the development of critical cultural awareness in order for students to take action in the world outside the classroom in parallel with classroom work, and to improve the world in however small a way. So Byron's model is very well known. It's highly accessible, and there's a lot written about it to support its implementation, making it really useful for language teachers. The teacher researcher Eva Burwitz-Metzler shows how Byrom's model could be implemented with her group of English learners in a German secondary school. She planned and taught 4 English lessons around the short story, The Circuit by Francisco Jimenez, a story about a family of Mexican migrant workers who are staying in the United States, an unfamiliar cultural experience for this group of German teenagers. And a series of tasks required the learners to respond to the story from different perspectives and to understand aspects of a foreign culture. And the aim was to develop their understanding of otherness. So as I mentioned, the circuit is a story about a large Mexican family of migrant workers in the American South. All of their belongings fit into what's described in the book as their ramshackle car, and they drive with a huge pot on the roof of the car in which all of the family meals are cooked. And the story is told in the first person narrative by Panchito, who is the second oldest child of the family. He describes his life between swiftly changing harvest sites and equally rapidly changing schools. And it's a new kind of experience for him as a non-native speaker in the American school system. He's surrounded by children who are strangers and who reject him, but a kind teacher not only offers him help in class with his English, but also starts teaching him to play the trumpet. And if it were not for this situation, Panchito would not have a lot to look forward to in school. But he fears that he'll have to leave again soon. At the end of the story, he returns from school full of plans and expectations, only to see his family around the car packed and ready to leave once more. Now, on the slide, we see some of the classroom tasks that the teacher created. So I'm going to go through them. And while I'm going through them, I'd like you to try to think which task do you think is best for developing intercultural communicative competence? So task 1 here, the students were first given the story with the pages in random order, obviously with no page numbers, with no title and no ending. They had to read their incomplete stories and put the pages in a logical order and then justify their order to their classmates. They then had to write their own endings to the story. That was activity 2 on the slide. The students then read the actual ending for the story and compared it with their own. And having read the ending, they were asked to give the story a title. So they still hadn't seen the title of the story at this stage. And then task 4 that the teacher created was to write a final scene for the story based on the prompt, well, actually based on various prompts, but here's one of them. The family moves on to their next job. They sit in the car. Mother and father start quarreling about Panchito, work with a partner, write down what they say to each other. Do you think they talk loudly? So I'll give you a few seconds just to process that information. Which of those activities do you think is best for developing intercultural communicative competence? You can put your numbers in the chat box. And if you want to explain why also, you could do that. I'll give you 30 seconds or so to do that while I grab some water. So which of these 4 activities do you think is the best one for developing intercultural competence and why, or intercultural communicative competence? Remember, Byram's model stressed the importance of developing curiosity and openness towards other cultures, and that the teacher's objective here was to help the students develop a sense of otherness and to be able to decenter. So according to the teacher herself here from Eva Berwitz Metzler, writing titles allowed the students to show some empathy with the characters and an understanding of key themes. Some of the titles that her students came up with were Losing a Friend and From Work to Work. And she also suggested that having students write their own endings to the story and writing new scenes could develop attitudes of curiosity and openness, right? And what's nice about this is these are purely intake response tasks, right? The students respond in meaningful ways emotionally and cognitively to the text rather than just working with the language. Presumably there'll be some language work as well, but these tasks which focus on developing intercultural communicative competence are really intake response tasks rather than language focused tasks. Now, in a chapter of a book for language teachers on materials development, Alan Polvinus and Brian Tomlinson argue for the use of science fiction, fantasy, and satirical literature in the language classroom for developing intercultural skills, arguing that such material may encourage students to not simply observe differences in the other culture, but to become less ethnocentric and more culturally relativist. The rationale for this view is that by the time the majority of learners encounter a foreign language for the first time, their own culture is so familiar, so much a given, that they do not see it. Their culture provides them with one way of looking at the world, and their language with only one way of articulating that perception. However, following Byram, for students to genuinely develop intercultural communicative competence, they need to be able to decenter and see things from other perspectives. To illustrate their point, Tomlinson and Polvinus use the example of a poem called A Martian Sends a Postcard Home. Now, I should mention before I go on, Tomlinson and Polvinus, if I didn't mention this, refer to science fiction or fantasy or satirical texts as estrangement texts. So they argue that estrangement texts can be a vehicle for having students reflect critically on their own culture. And so to illustrate their point, they use this poem by Craig Raine called A Martian Sends a Postcard Home, in which a visitor from outer space misreads the functions of everyday items on Earth, such as books, cars, telephones, and toilets, right? So in this poem, A Martian sends a postcard home. The Martian sees everyday objects that we have on Earth, but he or she confuses their function. So let me show you here the first part of the poem. In this part of the poem, the Martian is describing books. Now, I'm going to read it out loud in case anybody's watching this on a small screen. You can read along and listen. But as you do so, try to identify any references to books in this part of the poem. Okay? So, A Martian Sends a Postcard Home. Caxtons are mechanical birds with many wings, and some are treasured for their markings. They cause the eyes to melt or the body to shriek without pain. I have never seen one fly, but sometimes they perch on the hand. So I'll give you a few seconds to look at that again, and let me remind you that the idea of this poem is that the Martian has come to Earth and he or she is misunderstanding everyday objects. In this case, the Martian is misunderstanding books. So what references to books can you see in this part of the poem? I'll give you a clue with this first one. Caxtons refers to William Caxton. That's a little bit of an obscure reference for non-British people. William Caxton printed the first books in the UK sometime around 1470. So William Caxton had the first printing press in the UK. So straight away we have a reference to books here. Now, what else can you see? You can answer in the chat box if you like, but I'll start to go through them because we're short for time. So the reference here to birds with many wings, right? So perhaps wings here refers to the pages. When we hold a book open, maybe it looks like a bird. And some are treasured for their markings. Now, of course, birds can have markings, different patterns or different colors, different feathers. But books, we can refer to the words of the books as markings as well. And books are treasured for the words that they contain, right? And then the Martian goes on to say that they cause the eyes to melt or the body to shriek without pain. I understand here the eyes to melt as crying. So books can make us cry, or books can make us laugh, right? To shriek without pain. I have never seen one fly, but sometimes they perch on the hand. So the meaning of this word perch is to sit, right? So a bird perched in a tree, or a bird perched on a branch, bird sitting on a branch. And so sometimes when we hold a book in one hand, it could look like a bird. perching or sitting on our hands. Right, so lots of references to books in there. Now let me show you the end of the poem. And as we read it, try to identify what the Martian is describing in this final part of the poem. At night, when all the colors die, they hide in pairs and read about themselves in color with their eyelids shut. So I'll give you a few seconds to process that. What is the Martian describing here? You can tell me in the chat box if you like. So the first part is probably quite obvious. At night, when all the colors die, they hide in pairs. Who are they? Probably couples hiding, going up to their bedrooms and closing the door and going to bed. And they read about themselves in color with their eyelids shut. This sounds like dreaming to me. So isn't that lovely? The poem where the Martian is misunderstanding things that we take for granted here on planet Earth. Now, Pulvinus and Tomlinson go on to argue that literature which deals directly or indirectly with the immigrant or second generation bicultural experience and the diversity of increasingly multicultural societies can also push learners to challenge unquestioned assumptions too. They cite authors such as the Korean American Chagre Lee or the British Asian authors such as Monica Ali and Hanif Qureshi as examples of this. We're going to take a quick look at an extract from Monica Ali's Brick Lane novel, which is written from the perspective of a Bangladeshi immigrant living in London. But before we do so, I'd like you to try to imagine a mealtime at home with a few guests. So again, if you want to close your eyes, let's step into a different space and imagine it's a warm evening. You've invited a few friends over for a meal. And as you open the door, you see their familiar faces light up with smiles. Listen to the sound of their greetings, laughter, warm hellos, maybe a mix of languages blending together. Now step into the kitchen. The rich aromas of food fill the air, perhaps the scent of something slow cooked, the tang of fresh herbs, or the sweetness of dessert waiting to be shared. Notice the clinking of plates, the bubbling of a pot, the hum of conversation flowing naturally. Take a seat at the table, look around. Each person is eager to share something, a funny anecdote, a meaningful story, a piece of personal news. Voices rise and fall as people listen, react, and connect. As their meals begin, imagine the exchange of tastes, ideas, and experiences. How do you feel in this moment? Connected? Curious? Comforted? Now gently bring yourself back to the present. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And let's take a look at this extract from Monica Ali's Brick Lane, where she describes the experience of her and her Bangladeshi husband visiting another Bangladeshi couple in London. So they ate dinner on trays balanced on their laps, an unidentified meat in tepid gravy with boiled potatoes. It was like eating cardboard soaked in water. Mrs. Azad switched on the television and turned the volume up high. She scowled at Chanu and her husband when they talked and held up her hand when she wished to silence them altogether. She drank a second glass of beer and belched with quiet satisfaction. I'm going to guess that your visualizations of your meals with friends were probably not quite like this. As a British person, what's fascinating about this extract from Monica Ali's Brick Lane is that this is Bangladeshi people having dinner like the British people that I knew growing up. Microwave meals, miserable microwave meals on trays, sat around the TV while our parents watched soap operas or the news. And it's funny for us to see this through the eyes of these Bangladeshi immigrants in the UK. So it's forcing us to question aspects of our own, well, in my case, of my culture, British culture. Maria Francisca Reines, a grade 1 teacher in the United States, engaged her Latino learners in a very meaningful, culturally responsive activity. First, they read the bilingual picture book, René tiene dos apellidos, or René has 2 last names, by René Colato Lainez. It tells a story of a Salvadoran boy who goes to the US. To shorten his name, his teacher removes one of his 2 last names. After discussing the book and the naming conventions in Latin America and among Latinos in the US, Francisca and her students co-constructed a rap based on the story to the tune of Drake's Kiki, In My Feelings, Kiki, Do You Love Me? The lyrics to the co-constructed rap are here. Now, I am no rapper, but we can read this together. Oye, soy latino, tengo dos apellidos, nunca me los quites. Uno es de mi papi, el otro es de mi mami. And so here again, we have this kind of estrangement text as suggested by Polvenes and Tomlinson, which not only pushes students to decenter and see aspects of another culture, but for the minority background students in the classroom, it promotes openness towards their culture. It validates and affirms their prior experiences. It's inclusive and it promotes respect and tolerance towards others. In their book for teachers on teaching in immersion and dual language programs in the USA and Canada, Tedek and Lister argue that in multilingual contexts, cultural, intercultural, and cross-cultural objectives are an essential part of curriculum development alongside content and language objectives. They argue that this is especially important in immersion and dual language programs as they increasingly enroll students from a range of socioeconomic, ethnic, racial, cultural, and linguistic groups. Many, if not most, Canadian and US schools tend to represent mainstream, often white, middle-class, Eurocentric cultural values and norms. Some teachers may be familiar and proficient with these cultural frames, but less familiar with the specific cultural norms or orientations of their students. Indeed, a concept which is increasingly common in the literature is that of culturally sustaining pedagogy, an approach which supports multilingual and multicultural perspectives and practices for educators and students by fostering linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of schooling. A key principle of culturally sustaining pedagogy is stressing that other languages are an asset in language learning. And naturally, literature can play a role here. Now, the key tenets of culturally sustaining pedagogy are shown on the slide. An example of culturally sustaining pedagogy comes from the preschool classroom in the USA with children from heritage cultures as diverse as India, Brazil, Japan, and Morocco. This was a parent-led informed project where parents were invited to participate in lessons which showcased aspects of their culture. Activities included cooking, bringing in an artifact, choosing and reading a book, singing and presenting family routines. And with regard specifically to literature, parents were invited to choose and read a picture book representing their heritage, culture, and language during a read aloud time. During the unit on India, one parent read the book Bini's Diwali, containing information about the Hindu festival of lights and the story of a young Indian girl, Bini, who tells her classmates about the festival. During the reading, the parent frequently stopped to discuss concepts in the story and further explained text-based Hindi words like jalebis and facilitated associations for children to help scaffold their understanding, asking the children which treats they enjoy on holidays. So this particular project was based on these 4 tenets of culturally sustaining pedagogy that we see on the slide. So there you go, guys. Hopefully you found that interesting. And hopefully you have a clear idea of how literature can be used to support the development of intercultural skills in the classroom and to develop culturally sustaining pedagogy. Just in case you found that interesting, I leave references on the slide for you here. I'll give you a second to take a photo of that or take a screenshot of that. And I'd just like to say thank you for deciding to join me for this session. Thanks very much. Now, time for questions.